Ningshi Naira. Christ is risen indeed. Hallelujah. What a joy it is. And the young and the old are happy. Thank you very much for all those lovely special numbers. You have brought your gifts this morning to this joyful day. Christ has risen. And indeed, we will all be part of the New Jerusalem, joyful and free and joyful in God. Thank you, New Jerusalem. We are reminded by that lovely special number from our respected elder. Among us this morning, I see new faces, and I would like to welcome you on behalf of the pastor and the team here. Please feel free to stay on after the church. There's a tea fellowship. Come and meet and fellowship with us. Itum ngajaili mi kater sangaka meeting kupkai teli. You are welcome. Please come and meet us, stay with us, fellowship with us. There is, I'm sure, refreshment prepared by our very efficient deacons. Christ is risen. Welcome, all of you. Rinkaluya zimiksho salam natum katong kali ishi shimkorna midale. Hikata atam very we tui matui kawai wivang atam sam kapang hi very li ningashi. Kala katana binglila ningashi midale. Natum kajong kana ili encourage kala saya aina ngajon kami wivang ningshi haira. Many of you, like Friend Home and Anita Mila, many encourages me. Our Bijoy is one, and I'm thankful. And all of you, come and speak to me in Tangkul. My Tangkul will get better. Ka ituihi arui matada mamatatuda natumna ili piumelo. I acha shapshi tuina matuira. I also want to point to the Ibizilo magazine this morning. Ishi Women Hostel Warden Miss Hori Rongsong na resurrection maramhi matada kapi haidale. So please read it. Deep theology she has explained. I got a privilege to see the preview just last night as the secretary brought to my husband. So please read the article by our warden, Miss Hori Rongsong, on the resurrection. SAIACS. Lankashia proho. Nawi karinga tui itumli matui milo. Nawi laikashi tui shang sak milo. Nawi ming tek metairano jishu mingli saya sadali. Amen. Proho na jishuli kati aina ringluing sak haira. Hallelujah. Jishui kamasai jikor meramli Bible kabisang dale. Ringlui ka hai Jishu Krista mi pingli kachitai karajan tarada khni shida Bible kabihai dale. Jansam sada John muku Matthew muku de chishit Mark tarada trok Luke makudamati. Ringlui kahai jishuna awi sakhangatha pingli kala Pauli rajithaya Bible ati shurda ringlui ka hai jishuli sampang sekora mirin ngajay sera jansam sada Paulwi mirin kangajay Paul hi church we rekarek mi aka aina church we kamarek paukatsata sahawa kala varishiwi matai makeup kaji missionary akana Jishu Krista ringlui haida itumli sampangdali kala meter on ngasaktali aja ringluya ngathor hili ringluya Jishu Krista na itumli sampangda itumwi mirinli ngajai kawai hilai kala ajar ringkaluya ngathor hili ringkaluya Jishu Krista na itumli sampangda itumwi mirinli ngajai kawai hilai kala Ni Pasaran. It is a feature film released in 2018. It was made in memory of and also honor of some workers, some Scottish workers in Scotland, Glasgow, I think, in Rolls-Royce factory. Rolls-Royce makes the engines for the jet Hawker hunters, the ones that bombs from higher from the sky, bombs civilians. Now, one morning, some workers came into their usual routine to work in the factory in Scotland, and they saw that some engines, Rolls-Royce engines, were there to repair. Some of the workers said, "Ne pasaran, it will not pass." Why? Because these hunter hawkers, jet fighters, were used to spray bombs on innocent civilians in Chile in 1974 to 1978, when during the Pinochet's dictator's time. These brave Rolls-Royce workers said, "Our engines will not be prepared to bomb civilians, innocent people." A very moving story of the power of love for strangers and the strangers' well-being. Far away in the Northern Hemisphere, a small country, Scotland, these people were thinking about people in Southern America, in Chile. They loved them even though they were strangers. And this Ne Pasaran will not pass is a story of overwhelming goodness of humanity. And this Easter morning, I want to remind us all that the people who encounters the risen Lord will love, will do good, will be compassionate, will stand for what is right with courage. Because in the resurrection, our old self, with all its fear, anxieties, limitations, and selfishness, is overcome by the new creation in Christ. Christ conquered death and the evil forces, and we are transformed. And all the appearances, the 12 appearances of Jesus, the risen Christ, to his disciples and to others, including Paul, all illustrate this, the radical transformation that the risen Christ brings upon those who will encounter the risen Christ. This complete radical transformation is so radically seen in the life and work of Apostle Paul. A life lived for the good news of Jesus Christ, and a life that desired salvation and freedom for all. Before his encounter with the risen Christ on the way to Damascus, Saul, that was the Hebrew name, Paul, was a zealot, a persecutor of the disciples of Jesus Christ. And as the church grew in Jerusalem, Paul was among the hardliners against the followers of Jesus. We read in Acts 7:58, Otsak 7:58, we read, when Stephen was stoned to death, Paul was the one who kept the clothes of those murderers. And in Acts chapter Otsak Cheshit Akha, there it is written, Paul approved the killing of Stephen. Paul approved the killing of Stephen. And you also have in chapter 8, verse 3. I would like to read this in Ka Solna Church Shiman Kawai Sada Shim Shimli Zanglaka Shitkasanga Mayarno Lila Shano Lila Shimen Shokta Patokli Vasanga. He was against the church. He was a primary persecutor. We can use that perhaps before his encounter with the risen Christ on that road to Damascus. In today's language, Paul was an extremist before he met Christ. Extremists such as a Hindutva ideologue or a white supremacist or a fundamentalist Islamic. Those who hunt down others, such as minorities who are different from them. The extremists are those who exhibit violent intolerance to others who are different. And Paul was one such in his own words, as recorded in Acts chapter 22:4. He himself will say, I was a staunch persecutor of the church. I went after the disciples of Jesus Christ. Until that eventful day on his way to Damascus. And this eventful day, Paul was not going on a jolly ride to Damascus. His purpose is very clearly repeated and recorded by Luke in Acts chapter 9, 1-2. Let me read this in English. The Thankul translation, which is the Bible Society of India, the standard translation, is a little weak. So I will read it. It's only hikatha, like so. Hidada lailaka solna prohovi. So it's the connection is not. It's rather weak. So let me read in English. Meanwhile, Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any who belonged to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. You also you will also have to read it in Thankul and then compare it. he was going to Jerusalem, looking for the disciples of Jesus Christ to bring them bound to Jerusalem. But God in His grace and infinite wisdom appears to Saul and tells, Saul, Saul, kiwiwang aina nana ili rikarek kahawal kala. Why do you persecute me? The amazing grace of God can touch the most violent extremists. Saul, or Paul, is healed, as we read, with the help of Ananias, another follower of Jesus Christ. He is healed. His sight is restored, not just physical sight, but spiritual sight. His way is now directed. His perspective is reoriented to Christ, the way of life. And if you will, the rest is history. After Paul encountered Christ on the Damascus road, his life is transformed. And Paul himself records this experience, this wonderful transforming experience with the risen Christ. You can read this in Galatians 1:16 onwards, Galatia Akha Thradathrop, and 1 Corinthians 15:1 onwards, and also in Acts 22:6 onwards. After his eyesight is restored and he is baptized, he begins his mission to witness and to preach the good news that Jesus Christ is the Messiah, the one who will renew the creation and restore God's good creation to His fellowship. We read further on in Acts chapter 8, chapter 13, how Paul begins to preach, and there is wonderful, amazing impact. Even a Roman officer, a proconsul in Cyprus, Sergius Paulus, converts. He begins to believe in Jesus the Lord, the one whom Paul is witnessing. You read that in Acts 13. After encountering the risen Christ, Paul is transformed. Paul the zealot, Pharisee, somebody who was very deeply educated in the laws of his ancestors, as he writes in Acts 22. With a very good education, not least with one of the most famous rabbi of his days, Gamaliel. Such a zealot Pharisee changes his direction in encountering Christ, the risen one, and is transformed to be the foremost missionary and the most formidable public intellectual of the first century. This is what N.T. Wright, a New Testament scholar and expert in the studies of Paul, his latest book is a biography of Paul, very fascinating, and also formerly a Church of England bishop, N.T. Wright. He describes Paul as the most important public intellectual of first century. Every dimension of a modern society, from philosophy, from law, politics, Paul has written in his letters to the churches he started. So N.T. Wright will say, perhaps the second most important person in Christianity after Jesus Christ. Paul becomes a proto-missionary. A book, Paul and His Missionary Journey, written sometime between 19th and 20th century, was a handbook for missionaries as they worked cross-cultural contexts. And even today, mission students have to read those books to understand the inspiring work of Paul, and not only the inspiration, but the nitty-gritty details, the practicality, collecting money, prayer. All these are covered in this Paul's missionary journey. He took 3 missionary journeys. The gospel will reach till Asia Minor, which is today's Turkey, through Paul's missionary work. Paul becomes the greatest defender of the Christian faith. The book of Romans, one of the deepest biblical theological book that has inspired theologians from early church to today. Augustine, Martin Luther will construct his new theology, the Reformation, idea of Reformation, from reading Romans and Galatians, of course. And also Karl Barth, a 20th century German theologian. And today, N.T. Wright, Dunn, these are all very famous, faith-rooted New Testament scholars. Their scholarship is tested in their contribution to the reading of the Epistle to the Romans by Paul, defending and expositing, explaining the faith in Jesus Christ. Paul writes the greatest treatise on love, 1 Corinthians 13. Paul also writes the first declaration of a common humanity. And if N.T. Wright, if we can go along with N.T. Wright, he says perhaps the first vision of united nation. Because in Galatians 5:26-28, you have that. All children of God, all human beings are children of God in Christ. And Paul describes the practicality, the daily living of one who is being transformed by the risen Christ as he explains the new creation in Colossians chapter 3, Ephesians chapter 4:17 onwards. Paul also co-labored, he worked together with many, beginning with Barnabas, including 11 women. 11 women were co-workers, were with Paul, as they are listed in Romans 16. Women were very much part of his ministry. Paul, the learned Pharisee, redirected his ways, changed his mind in Christ after his encounter with the risen Lord. In the resurrection of Jesus Christ, God affirms his sovereignty, his power, and his love for us and for all creation. The resurrection is the central foundation of our faith, of Christianity. If there was no resurrection, there will be no Christianity. James Dunn, he would say that. Indeed, in resurrection, God affirmed his love for us. The raising of Jesus Christ from the dead defines us as children of the living God. Krista rinkalui hi itum shitkasanga we paisin. Our foundation, the risen Christ is our foundation. And those who meet the risen Lord is transformed. As we read in our responsive reading, we read in John chapter 20, Mary Magdalene a timid woman, afraid by the tomb. But once she met the risen Christ, she was emboldened, and she goes out joyfully, telling to the disciples, Christ is risen, the tomb is empty. And Mary and the women, they become the first witnesses of the empty tomb, first witnesses of the risen Christ, and how these women were transformed into courageous announcers of the good news. Because the resurrection testifies, the resurrection affirms that the cross is not the final, that the death of Jesus Christ is not the end, it is the beginning. Because God raised Christ from the dead, the cross does not have the final word. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German pastor and a theologian during the Second World War, a very great theologian. He was just beginning to develop his theology and claim his place as a theologian. He would travel around. He would spend time in America in the 1930s. He would spend time with the black churches, Abyssinia Baptist Church, that will impact him as a white German pastor. He has a comfortable calling to be a professor in one of the thriving divinity schools in America. But when he knew the brutal rule of Hitler and his policy of anti-Semitism, going after the Jews and killing them, Dietrich Bonhoeffer could not watch from USA. He said he will return to his country, Germany. And he and a group of pastors and theologians, German pastors and theologians, they form a resistant group to resist against Hitler's brutal policy, imprisoned for 3 years. And just days before the Allied forces came into Germany to free the Germans from the rule of Hitler, Bonhoeffer was executed in the prison. While he was imprisoned 3 years, Bonhoeffer wrote many books, treatises, and theological writings, letters on different topics, including Easter. And on the treatise on Easter, Bonhoeffer wrote, and I quote, "If cross had been the last word, then the world would be lost without hope. But God raised Christ from the dead. Therefore, the resurrection of Jesus Christ is God's yes to us." Close quotation. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is God's yes to us. Indeed, God's yes to us as His beloved children. Just days before he was executed, Bonhoeffer wrote to one of the partners from the Allied countries in England, a pastor in Church of England, George Bell. And in this letter, Bonhoeffer wrote, "This is the end for me." So this is just before he was executed, okay? Days before. "This is the end for me. But for me, the beginning of life. This is the end for me. I am going to be executed very soon, but this is the beginning." Bonhoeffer had the courage to write that because his faith was absolutely on the risen Christ, the Christ who has conquered the dark forces, who has conquered death, and have restored us into God's fellowship. Bonhoeffer could write, "In death is my beginning," just as Paul has also written. Likewise, may we begin anew with the risen Christ. This Easter morning, God says yes to us. God says yes to us in whatever circumstances, situations, conditions we are. God says yes to us because His Son Jesus Christ has risen from the dead. Christ is risen from the dead, conquering death and the dark forces, and have brought us hope and joy and the power to be changed. Christ is risen and He meets us. What is our response? The risen Christ meets us in our situations. Maybe Damascus, maybe in our fear, maybe in our selfishness. Christ is risen. He meets us. What is our response? May the power of the risen Christ give us the courage and hope to accept God's grace to be renewed into the new creation as God's people, the measure of the full stature of Jesus Christ. Christ is risen. Amen.